Hey guys, Dr. Israetel here for Renaissance Periodization. We're continuing on today with our second to last priority for raw powerlifting, which is variation. All right? In our chart here, variation comes in at number 5 in our priority list. So I'll say this right away before we get carried away talking about all these little intricacies and the science behind them. Variation is just not super important in powerlifting. It is a priority, but a lot of stuff ranks ahead of it. Let me put it this way. If you are training the powerlifting movements in the rep ranges that you need, one's for strength and for size, if you're overloading, you're presenting a challenge, you're lifting heavier weights, higher volumes, etc. If you're managing fatigue okay, and if your program is designed in a logical fashion, you're not training a bunch all at once or too interspersed, you're doing all right for yourself and probably doing pretty well. To put this in perspective, some very famous powerlifters, Ed Cohen is a very good example of this, trained in more or less the same couple of lifts for their entire careers and were the best of all time. So you can get away without too much variation, but intelligent use of variation helps. So basically, visually imagine variations all the way up the top, that little yellow sliver. It's not a huge deal, but if you want the best out of your powerlifting program, maybe it's a good idea to sort of put together what kind of variation is good, what kind is bad, what the purpose is, etc., etc. So let's take a look at that. So first, we get a little definition going on. With weeks of the same sort of training, the same muscles and motor units are taxed in exactly the same ways. The same energy systems are taxed in exactly the same ways, or very similar ways, and the nervous system is taxed in the same way. So it's all very monotonous. And what ends up happening is negative feedback loops start to sensitize. And what that does is the body, or those particular regions of the body, those muscles, those portions of the nervous system, become resistant to change. That means gains will slow down. Sometimes if you really don't vary for long enough, they stop. And they can even reverse through a process called local overreaching. So if you consistently do tons of incline benching all the time, incline, same grip, same everything, your upper pec fibers might actually locally become overreached, which is kind of a form of overtraining. And they might actually start to regress on you, and you might start to pull them and all that sort of bad stuff that happens. That's unlikely, but what you're definitely going to be doing if you don't use variation enough is you'll have a stale training routine. And that's problematic because you won't be getting the gains that you could be if you varied some things up. So in powerlifting, variation keeps the gains coming in a couple of ways. It targets different muscles, different motor units, different CNS or nervous system essentially patterns. It targets the nervous system in a different way. And it allows gains to be made in that new set of systems. So perhaps if you were really focusing on chest for a while and chest training, you could switch to a little bit more triceps emphasis pushing in your routine, and those systems, the triceps, etc., close grip pushing ability, start to get help, which is good because they contribute to powerlifting performance. Now, a real big benefit of variation is that while your triceps are getting hit, your chest can recover and desensitize to the old training. So then you can go back to your old exercises, regular grip bench pressing or wide grip bench pressing, and experience new gains because those previously stale exercises are stale no longer. So variation is kind of a trade-off. You do something for a while, you get better at that, keep the other thing on the back burner, switch back, and you can do your old style of training, which is now going to be beneficial again. For an example, kind of just went over this, so I'll go really fast here. For benching, you push your pecs and your pec training really hard for 2 months. Do perhaps some kind of deficit pressing with a cambered bar, dumbbell flies, wide grip benching, etc., etc. Then you push your triceps hard for 2 months. And then you repeat the process. Once your pecs have really recovered and have resensitized, they're going to be able to grow for you again. And this really does set you up to hit pretty big PRs. Because once you come back to regular bench pressing, after close gripping for a while, regular benching is fresh, and you make gains, and you make PRs, and then you repeat the process over and over and over again. Now, that's how it's supposed to work. Some bad ideas we see with some training programs with regard to variation. You cannot use enough variation. And what happens then is, let's say you use only the same 5 moves in training for years and years and years. Ed Cohen did it, but you're probably not Ed Cohen. You might not be able to get away with something like that. Or you train for maximum strength all year round. Sets of 1 to 3 all year round. There's no variation in rep range. And thus the energy systems and nervous system patterns are essentially the same. They're training all the time, and they accumulate quite a bit of staleness. If you are employing variation, you could be making another mistake. And that is if you use moves that violate the other principles, particularly violating overload and violating specificity. So, for example, you can do prowler pushes for leg training for a couple of weeks, but why not just do high rep squatting? That's much more specific to powerlifting itself. You can get real good at pushing the prowler and it will transfer almost none or none to powerlifting performance. Heck, it could make you worse. But if you do high rep leg training, high rep front squats, you're gonna get big quads and it's gonna transfer. So it's more specific. So we have to make sure when we're using variation, we don't violate specificity. And in the second example, overload. Okay, so it's time for you to hit your triceps a little bit differently than usual. Can you do cable one-arm tricep extensions, which I apparently pick on all the time? Can you do those for tricep training? Well, yeah, if you don't want to present an overload, it's just not going to be enough to push your bench press through the roof. That's just not how you get a big bench. Last but not least, you can vary too often. There is such a thing as too much variation. And it violates a sub-principle of specificity called directed adaptation. Here's what directed adaptation basically states. It states that if you want to get good at something and keep those adaptations, when you change focus, that something, that form of training, needs to be presented in sequence for quite a bit of time, perhaps several weeks in regard to powerlifting training. So that if you alter exercises once a week all the time, essentially at random, you're not going to retain a lot of gains you get from each one of those movements. You'll get their general benefits, but the specific benefits won't be there. So if you're weak off the chest, you need to do some benching off the chest and maybe some camber bar work and some chest work for at least a couple of weeks for you to retain those gains when you go back to your regular bench press training. If you just go from the deficit and do some dumbbell flies every now and again, there's not much of a guarantee that you'll actually hold on to those gains and your bench press might still be limited off the chest. That's a serious drawback of West Side type programs. I guess you could call it conjugate periodization or what have you. But if you alter exercises all the time, you end up being okay at all of them but not great at any one thing. And you can't logically sequence exercises together, which for raw powerlifting is probably a pretty big problem. Now, on the plus side, good ideas in applying variation. You should probably use logical progression in how you construct your variation. This is a little bit of a preview of the next lecture, which is going to be on phase potentiation. So if you want to add size to a muscle, in which you use that size later for strength, you use the derivative specialty moves for that muscle, and you use higher reps to gain size. So what an example of that would be, you use high bar squats and front squats in the 6 to 10 rep range for a couple of months to try to get your squat up. Your squat won't go up yet, right? After that, you take a couple of months and go back to the competition moves for actual strength development and for peaking. So you can use low bar squats and sets of 3 to 5 again. Now that you have that new muscle from the variation you imposed earlier, logical variation, you can use that new muscle to get stronger in the squat and to actually have very good performance. Also, and this is something powerlifters have known for a very long time, basically review, you should use variation not at random but to target needed areas. For example, if you have a problem with your lockout, doing some close grip work is probably a good idea when it's time for you to add muscle. Or when it's time for you to pick a variant, you should probably more often than not pick one that targets lockout abilities or triceps abilities or something like that, which will help you with your lockout. If you vary at random, you're going to get better for sure, but it might not be better in exactly the way you want it. So you might blast 455 off of your chest and get caught at the meet just short of lockout like you always do. Now, last meet, you did that with 425, but you still missed 455 this time. If you had just put that lockout work in the variance of the program, maybe you would have gotten it, right? And missed lifts are not something that's a very good idea, no matter how awesome they look to begin with. Another example is if you want bigger deadlifting muscles, bigger erector muscles, bigger glutes, bigger hamstrings that will eventually translate to better performances, or if you're weak off the floor, deficit deadlifting is a good idea. If your deficit goes up, that won't necessarily immediately transfer to your deadlift, but especially if you're weak off the floor and if you're going through a hypertrophy phase and need to gain size, a good use of variation is to focus on deficit pulling. Deficit pulling will make you awesome off the floor, or better, and it'll enhance the size of your glutes, your erectors, your hamstrings, so that when you come back to regular deadlifting, you have more muscle to work with and potentially more strength to gain. To close out the discussion, just a couple of sort of real-world tips for you guys. So the best rate of exercise change, so we said there's too often and there's not often enough. What's the best rate? Probably every 1 to 2 months or so is a good time to switch up some of the exercises. That gives us enough time to get the benefits of directed adaptation so we can keep those gains, but also it's enough of a disbursement to actually have a good effect from variation and never encounter true staleness. And when you're picking your movements, use overloading moves. That's a huge recommendation that can't be stated enough. Your lockout strength comes from close gripping 405, okay? It's not from one-arm dumbbell extensions overhead or something like that. You can do those till you're blue in the face, but until you can use really serious exercises for your triceps, your lockout won't budge a bit. And kind of on a related note, even though you're varying some exercises, don't drop out the basics. Rarely should you do a mesocycle or training cycle of a couple of weeks without some form of compound pressing, some form. That could even just be overhead press. It doesn't have to be a bench. Some form of squatting. So there's never, unless you're injured or something, should there be a cycle where you just do leg presses and you do no squats whatsoever. And pulling. If you stay away from all pulling variants, whether it be stiff-legged, deficit, block pulls, or regular pulls, for more than a mesocycle at a time, even one mesocycle at a time, you're probably risking not getting the right kind of adaptations and your powerlifting performance not going up. So, to sum up, variation is important if used intelligently. Is it super important? Not really. Can you use it for a benefit? You absolutely can, and hopefully some of these tips helped you guys out. All right, that's all I've got for this time. See you guys next time for our last video in this series on phase potentiation. Sounds scary. See you then.